Shalom, loved ones. If I were to ask you to draw a picture or show me a photograph of what you see in your mind's eye when you hear the words church and worship, I wonder what it would look like. In PlayWell, as you know, we are going about a different way of being church and worship. Well, when I perform an image search of the word church on Google, the lion's share of the images that appear are photographs of a church building. Less than a quarter of them include photographs of people, and those people happen to be gathered in a church building. And in that sampling, the people are usually standing. Some of them have their hands raised, and they're facing the front where there is a band playing on a stage. The older I get, the more I feel this way of thinking about church and worship is limited, extremely limited. There's nothing wrong with it, to be sure, but there's so much more to embrace, isn't there, as we are discovering in our little PlayWell community. Indeed, in John chapter 4, Jesus himself offers us an expansive vision of what it means to worship, even as he himself embodies what it means to be the church. Last week we looked at the first part of this chapter, and we noticed how Jesus cuts through the ways we tend to label others as either in or out. In the first part of this narrative, then, Jesus disrupts the dehumanizing cycle of discrimination by treating the Samaritan woman with love, respect, and compassion. For the first time in her life, the woman knew that she was seen, understood, and loved. In verse 19, then, she has an epiphany about Jesus because of the way that he's treating her and the fact that he sees her and loves her. He's obviously a prophet, a seer, quite literally, she realizes. So she decides to ask him for his insights about a centuries-old debate between the Samaritan Jewish people and the rest of the Jewish world. The debate is centered around the question about where the temple should be located. At one time in Israel's history, there were two temples, remember. There was one in Samaria and one in Judea. About 100 years before the time of Jesus, however, the temple on Mount Gerizim in Samaria was destroyed by the Judeans. So ever since, the Samaritans believed that God would send a deliverer to rebuild their temple. Now, to understand what's really going on in this text, we need to remember that the central image that John employs in his writing about Jesus is that Jesus is the Word made flesh who has come to tabernacle among us. That's what John 1:14 literally says. It's the image of Jesus as the tabernacle of God. That's what John keeps coming back to again and again throughout his gospel. In Israel's history, God assured the people that God was in their midst, wherever they were, through the structure of the tabernacle that was literally placed in the middle, in the center of their encampment, wherever they were. As a center of worship, the tabernacle was distinct from the temple in that the temple was a fixed-in-place location, whereas the tabernacle was movable, fluid. The tabernacle then reminded the people that there was never any place they could go where God was not with them. Now, this is what Jesus essentially says to the woman when she asks where the temple should be, the center of worship. He essentially says to her that the answer is neither here nor there. You see, he confronts our fixed in place. He disrupts our kind of fixed mindset about this fixed in place space where we tend to go to worship. By his answer, the way he answers the Samaritan woman, he reveals that her question is predicated on faulty either-or thinking, kind of fixed mindset about what worship is and where we worship. Indeed, the irony of this interchange is that the woman is having this conversation about the temple with Jesus, the very tabernacle of God, in her midst. John has paved the way for us to see this in the story by the assertion about Jesus in John chapter 1, that he's the tabernacle of God, followed by the acts of Jesus in John chapter 2, when Jesus critiques the centrality of the temple in the collective imagination of the people. And as he continues the narrative, John then presents us with an interesting contrast. In John chapter 3, Jesus meets in private at night in Judea with a member of the Jewish ruling council, Nicodemus. But in chapter 4, Jesus moves from Judea, where the temple is located, to Samaria, where he meets in public with an outcast in broad daylight. The ironic part of this is that this broad daylight revelation of Jesus as the tabernacle of God was prompted, we learn in the early part of John 4, by the Pharisees. The Pharisees, a term that is derived from the Aramaic, meaning to divide or separate. That's what the Pharisees are. The Pharisees were known thus as separatists in the sense of being purists or separated ones. That's what the word Pharisee means. So, the picture we have here in John chapter 4 is a picture of how the separated ones, that is the Pharisees, have driven away the set-apart one, that is the Jesus tabernacle. And because of this, it is the one who has been separated, that is the Samaritan woman herself, whose life has been enlightened by the set-apart one, that is Jesus. Jesus then is the one who has been set apart by God to come close to those no one else wants to come close to. Jesus enters our divisions and our propensity to separate. This picture has profound implications for how we think about what it means to be the church and what true worship is and is not. In our text today, Jesus speaks directly to the question of worship, even as he addresses our faulty, fixed view of the church through his teaching on the temple and his embodiment of the tabernacle. And what we see in this story is that the Church of Jesus Christ is an on-the-move, inclusive community that is constantly being recreated by the Spirit. The Church of Jesus Christ is an on-the-move, inclusive community that is constantly being recreated by the Spirit. That is what we see in this text, literally. This way of viewing what it means to be the church takes off the table the question of where we prefer to go to worship, because Jesus teaches us that worship is not about an event-based place to which we go on a certain day of the week at a certain time of the day to sing a certain set of songs. Worship is about encounter with the living Christ who is with us in every place and who is with every person we meet. In John chapter 4, we see quite literally that the tabernacle of God is at the local watering hole with the outcasts and the so-called sinners. Indeed, Jesus is even now flipping the tables of our temples today, and he has left the building to be present to the ones we are sure God has rejected. Meanwhile, the church in our society today seems to have taken on the role of the Pharisaic separatists, taking it upon ourselves to determine who is in and who is out. Not only have Christians ignored the command of Jesus to let the wheat and weeds grow together, as he says in one of his parables, but we have presumed to know who is who in that parable in the first place. Indeed, it is by such a presumption that those who assume they are the wheat have in fact become the weeds. In her preoccupation to be separate, the church has driven the beautiful, good, and life-giving essence of Jesus from our presence. In PlayWell, I am hoping, it is my desire that we would embody a different way of being. And that's why we do church the way that we do it. Why we think of it the way we think of it. You see, Jesus knew that he was not set apart to be separated. No, he was set apart to be with us, all of us. And it's this desire to be with that forms the very heart of true holiness, in contrast to the way of the Pharisees. In other words, we show our worship and devotion to God. We become truly holy like Jesus by our compassion and solidarity, by our inclusivity and our empathy. We can know we are truly abiding in the light of the Jesus tabernacle when we see others the way Jesus sees them, through the eyes of love, breaking down all division by truly knowing one another face to face and being at table together. As those who desire to follow Jesus, that is our vision of what it means to be the church. That is my hope for what we will embody as a PlayWell community. We are set apart to be with. We are set apart to be with. And when we live this way, you see, the building can come down, because God will surely rebuild God's people in a whole new way. When we live this way, the church cannot be put in a box or kept behind walls, and worship cannot be canned. When we live this way, we carry the life of Jesus within, and we discover the life of Jesus in surprising places wherever we are, with everyone we meet. It's time to come out of the dark and into the light. May we identify with the outcasts and drink from the well with Jesus, who is there already. May we be the church here and there and everywhere as we worship in spirit and in truth. Amen and amen.